Okay, hi everybody. Good morning. Really appreciate you guys being up early in the cold and joining us here. I hope coffee and everything else helped cheer you up your day and get started the best way possible. Welcome to Connecting the Americas. This is actually our second session. If you've missed that, if you don't know yet what we are, it's basically a hub for people who are in tech to power up, grab good food, connect, get to know other folks in the industry that are innovating. So as we're getting ready, I want to introduce you to Antonio Alves. He's one of our co-creators, right? And basically just give you a right welcome. He is founder and CEO at Infomac, right? And he's also a board member of Midwest Ventures. So let's welcome him.
Good morning, everyone. How are you all feeling today? Good? Great? Amazing? We create Connecting the Americas to connect people, knowledge, and opportunities. These are all three reasons for having you here today. I hope you enjoy your time with Austin and Alberto. Enjoy your day. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Well, last but not least, before we get into the heart of the discussion, I just want to thank the organizations that help us put this event together. So we have UbiMinds, and for you to know, so they support software companies to internationalize their team, find LATAM talent, and also keep those people motivated and going and performing. We have Infomac, so that is a AWS partner. They do generative AI, managed services, and cybersecurity solutions. And we also have AWS, that I'm guessing needs no introduction, but it's the most comprehensively and widely used cloud that we have out there. Okay, enough of the official. Let me hand this over for you guys. Just to get we're going to have a 40-minute conversation. And after that, we're going to open for a couple of questions. So please do be active and feel free to address your speakers. And now, without further ado, let me just introduce our guest for today for UX for Billions. So we have Alberto Silveira. He's going to mediate and facilitate. So just so you guys know, he is a published author. He is also a CEO, right? He's also in Forbes Tech Council and co-creator of this event as well. And our guest speaker is Austin Knight. So he's a senior product manager at Square and also advisor at Sequoia Capital. He has been through companies like Google, HubSpot, so there's plenty of experience there, from very small to very huge user bases. So all of this, welcome, thank you for being here. And let's give us a round of applause for Alberto and Austin.
All right. Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm excited to chat.
Good morning. Yeah, me too. Is that working, guys? Yes, it's on. 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
All right. Good, I know how to count until 3. Austin, what a pleasure to be talking to you in front of everyone. So we're going to be talking today about UX for billions of users, and I would like to start talking about let's not just jump on the billions yet, but just want to actually, so people understand your trajectory. What is like the least impactful or like least number of users design that you did for like small user base?
Yeah, so of course designers are afflicted with a high degree of self-criticism. I tend to think about my failures a lot more than successes, so thank you for the question. I think probably the least impactful thing I worked on was I was at a startup. It was an e-commerce startup. I joined as the first designer. This is a relatable story, I imagine, for some of you all here. Redesigned the entire thing because it sucked. And it was like a whole, I'm talking website, like whole product funnel. We were, basically we were selling personalized dog food. I'm glad to see that we had a dog instead. And we had to design like this whole product funnel so that you could customize the dog food and all of this stuff. Turns out it actually wasn't that great of an idea. It failed. After I was only at the company for 7 months, I think almost nobody used it, but I learned a lot from that experience about what it means to fight through against the odds to get to an MVP, and then realize actually this isn't going to work. We need to pivot to something else. So even though that particular experience was not impactful in terms of affecting a lot of people or having a lot of people use it, it was impactful on me personally, and it's an experience that I'm able to look back on when I am designing things that I know a lot of people are going to use, and I can pull from that experience, right? So if you're ever in a situation where you're working on something that feels like it's not going anywhere, maybe ultimately fails, I would just keep in mind, like, it's really not a failure unless you fail to learn from it. So think about, like, this thing that didn't work, what are the things that I can apply to my next venture that may actually be applicable to a large audience of people?
Moving from that to the most impactful UX design, I mean, just what is that?
Yeah, I've worked on a few different things that I think were really impactful. I led the design for Chrome Mobile, so if you've used the Google Chrome browser, iOS and Android, designed a lot of features that you're probably familiar with, some of which I use today and I'm like, this is horrible. Yeah, sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Chrome. I also, if you've used any of Google's feeds, that like a couple years ago they went through a huge redesign. I was one of a couple people that designed all of that. So when you're pushing to a user base as large as like Chrome's or Google's feeds, I think when I was releasing designs, we had 3.5 billion users across our mobile platform. So everything is an experiment. You're really, really cautious. If you cause a drop in certain metrics that could just be a fraction of a percent, your feature is going to get killed, and it could be something that you're working on for months. So this is the opposite of that other experience where like I was just trying to get as much stuff out as possible to see what was going to work, throwing it against the wall. When you're working at scale, a lot of it is just like really, really tweaking the fine details, and that takes a lot of patience. I also was one of 4 designers that was responsible for Google and Apple's COVID-19 contact tracing platform, which was adopted by over 40 public health authorities around the world. We were working really fast, working across platforms and companies. Actually, it was a really unique partnership. That was fun. At HubSpot, I joined as the first UX designer for HubSpot.com. We redesigned. This is after the startup experience where like I was trying to figure out the e-commerce funnel and the conversion process and how the product was going to work. When I went to HubSpot, redesigned basically did the same thing, but at a different scale. We had like 10,000 customers. Tripled the conversion rate. It accounted for tens of millions of dollars in ARR by the time that I left. And we had over 10 million monthly active users. That took years, But I would say those are some of the things that I look back on and I think that was good.
From the least to the most impactful. Appreciate sharing that. Like when you're building a software product, of course you don't build by yourself. You start building a team, which I like to call high-performance teams from the engineering, design, product leadership. But how do you build your team? Like how do you start actually building your design team to actually building solutions for billions of users?
Yeah, well, there is a paradox in that good designers hire good designers. So I think that when you're starting out, and you're at a really small scale, it's hard to make that first design hire realistically. And recruiters can certainly help to source and scale your design hiring, but actually identifying the right first designer is something that you kind of need an experienced design leader to do. So usually what I recommend is that folks try to identify a design leader that is in their industry or somebody that maybe has done what they're wanting to do with their company and bring them on as a consultant or something to that effect. Try to tap into their network. Another thing is that good design attracts good designers. So really pushing to make sure that those first few things that you're putting out there actually look good and are built on a solid foundation design-wise. Of course, there's the engineering, there's the product strategy and everything as well. But if, you know, as a designer, if I'm thinking about joining a startup and I see, oh, it's only like 2 or 3 people, 4 people, and they're all co-founders, but they've got a really, really nice design, that would actually be a really positive signal for me. But, you know, if it's like there's no designer and the product looks like it was built by an engineer, nothing against engineers. Yeah.
Now we'll get started.
You know, that you're going to be fighting an uphill battle to get top talent. So I think design, it should be within the first 5 hires. And then if you make a good first design hire, that's going to go a long way, not just for building the foundation for the product, but also for the org structure.
It's interesting you're saying that because as a CTO myself, you know, I joined smaller companies and bigger companies, and there's always that battle to actually bring design to the conversation. And organizations, like, it's not a matter of if you need to bring design, it's a matter of when, and the later it gets, you're gonna have to at some point refactor or like redo it. And one of the things that I say in my book is like the whole chapter about the iron triangle. How do you see like the collaboration? And the iron triangle is like the whole idea of bringing design, product, engineering together. How do you see that concept, and how do you apply that at Square, or like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the right way to organize a product team, right? Product, design, engineering, that's the iron triangle. I've read your book.
Yeah.
That's how we organize our product teams at Square. That's how we did it at Google. Obviously, there are other ancillary functions that you would plug into a team where it makes sense, like maybe a data scientist or researcher, whatever it is. I think that that is the right recipe. I think that ultimately for design, you know, when you're thinking about the return on investment for design, that can be a hard thing to quantify. It can be especially difficult if you don't have the right functional structure. Design has to be accountable to design standards, and too often we make design accountable to product standards or engineering standards or business standards. It's not to say that it isn't important. What it is to say is that, and I've written a couple essays that kind of touch on this, one of which is called Design is Not Art, the other is called Good Design is Humble. And basically what I'm trying to get at here is that it's hard to quantify the impact of design without strong design leadership that can articulate that to the rest of the business. This goes back to your early hires that you would be making. The 2 essay names, Design is Not Art and Good Design is Humble. Effectively, what I'm trying to do in these 2 essays is not necessarily remove subjectivity from design, but trying to bring a little bit more of an objective eye to it, so that you can hold design more accountable. And what that requires, in my opinion, is a functional structure, which would look like a VP of design, a chief design officer, a head of design, whatever it is, that ultimately reports to the CEO. Design reports all the way up to that person. You don't have design like reporting to a VP of engineering or even a VP of product, which a lot of companies like to do. Yeah, Apple is organized in this way. Square is organized in this way, the functional model, and I believe in it. I think that it really improves the quality of the design work, because with that model, you have design holding design accountable. And of course, the entire company is accountable to a single P&L in that model as well, which creates interesting incentives across the business.
Thanks for sharing that, Austin. So, how, with that organization collaboration, like how do you design your product for at scale? Like where do you start? Like what are like the considerations that you have to have, and like I don't know. It's like the number of interactions, like how much you want to invest it, you know, and balance like the MVP with like a good design, and is there any magic there?
I think that you know, especially when you're operating at scale, there can be a real temptation to like over-index on perfection. You know, so I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here, because you may think the designer is a perfectionist. I'm not. I think that you should move fast. You should release things and learn from them. but you should ultimately be held accountable to the quality of the design work. What I'm getting at here is that, especially if you're in, say, a small to medium-sized company, I think that as you think about operating at scale and increasing the scale of your company, there is going to be this sort of creeping desire to introduce more and more process and more constraints, more gates to actually getting something out the door. I think that can become crippling. A lot of companies, a lot of design teams kind of like go through this ebb and flow of like over-processizing and under-processizing. Where we're at now is somewhat of a healthy balance between the two, which is that design will take principled risks. So what this means is that our design organization, we understand the product, we have good instrumentation, we know how it's performing. The designers are data literate, right? They understand the business, they listen to the earnings calls, even when they're bad. But we make strategic decisions to invest in bets, right? And to release those things in at a high velocity and in meaningful ways. So like what I'm talking about is you may come up with an entirely new product concept, design the thing really quick, get it out the door, put it out there and see how it does. And in my case, I've been doing this at companies that are operating at a pretty serious scale, and we're not afraid to do that. You can't be afraid to do that. So I think that like the point that I'm making here is that I think that sometimes there is also a tendency to overthink the scale that you're at. Unless you're working for a handful of companies, you're probably not shipping stuff to like billions of people, right? Basically, anything below that, in my opinion, is there isn't significant risk. And I'm not talking about, there's like the legal and compliance side of things. You have to be careful about that. I work at a fintech company. I hear about it all the time, trust me. But I think that like trying to resist the temptation to overdo it with process, to over perfect before you start to learn is really important. And then eventually you'll get to a scale where you're like, wow, we're like 5 times the size that we were a year ago. Can you believe that we were obsessing over these small things that in the grand scheme of things were just like completely inconsequential?
You work now at Square. It's a design-driven organization. Can I say that? Yeah.
We don't use docs. we everything is in Figma, believe it or not. Not in Google Docs. Like Jack presents from Figma. I didn't believe it until I saw it.
Yeah. It's and have you worked like in a non-design-driven organization?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what challenges you face when you were actually working in an organization that is not driven by design?
I think that, well, first, I guess that what I should say is I don't think that in order to be successful, you have to be a design-driven organization. I think that design has to be a core component as part of like what we were talking about with the iron triangle. It's one of 3 critical components to really making a product team function. It doesn't necessarily mean that design has to be like at the helm or even at the core of everything that you're doing. But what I will say is that when it's completely neglected or not considered as part of the team, the structure, the strategy, it creates massive blind spots and opportunities to be disrupted. And the only time that I've really seen that like actually work for a meaningful period of time or at a meaningful scale is when the business has some kind of a moat, usually through like regulatory capture or just like the sheer age of the company, like they were very, very early movers, or maybe it's involved in something in the public sector. So I guess that what I'm getting at here is like the companies that I've seen do well, make a lot of money, and exist for a long time that don't really care about or invest in design, usually have some kind of protection, like maybe they're in the healthcare industry, which is heavily regulated, or maybe they have some kind of quasi-monopoly through another set of factors that prevents them from being disrupted. Everybody else is ripe for disruption. It's just a matter of time. So I view it as not investing in design, especially early on, because it's way cheaper to invest in at an early stage of a company than later. You don't have to retool everything. Not investing in it is a huge strategic risk.
As everything else, right? If you invest early enough, it becomes cheaper than actually trying to redo it. It's kind of like it's a basic principle, I guess.
Yeah.
So when you are designing, does your design approach or how you think about designing your product change industry by industry, as an example?
Yes and no. Human factors don't change, right? We all have 4 fingers and a thumb. The way that we interact with a device, that's not going to change depending on whether you're in an app from a retail vertical versus like a healthcare vertical or a food and bev vertical or something like that. So I think that like the core of design and really what makes design work doesn't change. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, the day-to-day approach and practices of a design team are going to change pretty dramatically by industry. It's something that, if I'm designing a consumer app, what I can get away with is very different than from if I'm designing a business-to-business application. Like when I was working on HubSpot, the line of communication to the customers was incredibly direct because every single customer had like, a 6-figure contract with us, and they had an account manager. And if we pushed something that wasn't good, the account manager was going to show up at my desk. That's different than something like Chrome, and this is unintuitive, but that user base is huge. I can put something out there, and we'll hear a lot about it maybe on Twitter or something like that, but by and large, like it's nowhere near as direct of communication. So we had to do a lot more like research outreach. Like at Google all the time, we were traveling to, like I went to Kenya, Nigeria, Brazil, China, Indonesia, India, all over the place, and Europe and everything like that for research because we needed to meet the people that were using our product face to face because there isn't so much of a direct.
That was a fun job, huh?
That was fun, yeah. I mean, stressful. Yeah, and I think that this also sort of plays into your question earlier about like what is it like to work for an organization that isn't design driven. Definitely, like industry by industry, the influence of design changes a lot. And I find that like when leaders don't value design or aren't tapped into design or at least pay some degree of attention to it, if there are designers in the organization, they'll spend like 50% of their time just trying to justify the value of design internally.
That's exactly right. I've seen that's happening so many times.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely wasteful.
Oh, it burns so much energy.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually you can move like an inch in the right direction, but it burns a lot of gas. Yes. So we talk about like if we change the approach by industry. How about company size?
I think that being small is a competitive advantage in most industries. Again, the exception would be the monopolistic industries or industries with heavy regulation. Being small probably doesn't work out that well there, but everywhere else, I think that being small is a competitive advantage. But we tend to not think that way. I remember when I was at a startup, I thought, man, if only I had the resources that
that's the dream.
Yeah. If I had the resources that my competitor that's 10 times the size had, I would be able to be so much more effective. But I was failing to see how much more nimble I could be by contrast. And there is this, I think, a desire that especially when you're in the early days of building a company, to look at who's doing it really well and then basically just copy them. And usually the ones that you're copying are doing it at scale because you aspire to operate at scale. In my opinion, that's the quickest path to mediocrity. Because I can say from being within these organizations, even ones that are pretty innovative, because they're operating at such scale, they move slow. It's hard to...
We talk this about like the analogy, I love analogy with boats, and it's like it's a big cruiser ship with like a small boat. Like this is a startup. This is actually a big enterprise. This is more agile than that. And then you told me something that stuck to my head is like, yeah, but like in the bigger ship, when I make like a small turn, the impact on the users are like, it's massive.
Yeah.
So that's
the difference.
That's the difference.
If you're in a speedboat, you can go like this all day long, and you're way more nimble. If you're on a huge oil tanker or something like that, you know, you're not going to be able to make as big of as quick of maneuvers, but that small maneuver that you do make is going to displace a lot of water. But the problem is that when you're copying a company that's operating at such scale, like for example, if you were, you know, to copy Airbnb or something like that, they have millions of users. Airbnb is a very innovative company. It's also a design-driven company. They've established a lot of design and interaction paradigms that are effectively standards at this point. They have patents for these things, but you know, they've become standards that you interact with now in apps outside of theirs on a daily basis. Those were innovations that don't feel like innovations to us, because as soon as a large organization innovates on something and releases it, they release it at such scale that it becomes ubiquitous. And then commonplace, right? It becomes obvious. And so, you know, when you're in a smaller organization and you're innovating, I think that your innovations can come off more like real, novel innovations. If you're copying the innovations or the strategy of a large organization, effectively what you're doing is copying what is already ubiquitous. It's no longer an innovation to the user, even if it is so much of an innovation or an invention that they could get a patent on it.
And that happens more often than, I work in startups, I do consulting for smaller to mid-sized companies. And there's always this, oh, if Google does, I will do it. If there's like this mindset, you don't need to be doing what that big ship is doing. Like, you know, that's gonna cost a lot, it's expensive, not necessarily your answer. That resonates a lot with what you're saying, like copying is not a good idea. Get inspired, maybe yes, not copying.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's definitely things that are worth copying, like basic interaction patterns and things like that, that have, you know, that users expect when they're interacting with a digital app or whatever it may be. But yeah, I mean, to your point, like at Google, by the time something, a lot of the stuff that I worked on, by the time that it made it into your all's hands, I was done with it for probably over a year. And you know, I may have worked on it for a couple of years. There's stuff that I've been out of Google for 3 years. There's stuff that I worked on that's still making its way out right now. And of course, it's taken on a different form, you know? So whenever, you know, you're at that point where it's like, I know that we're using Google as the example, but you can take much smaller companies at much smaller scale, you know, with 100,000 customers, 10,000 customers even sometimes. If you're copying what they're doing, you're probably a couple years behind, honestly. It's going to take you some time to release it too, regardless of how nimble you are.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about, we talk about the design-driven organizations, but people talk a lot about the word culture. You know, like there's what's the engineering culture, Alberto? Like what's the product engineering culture? There's, you know, and what is the design culture, you know, in an organization, in your definition, in your experience, like, and how do you bring that design culture to a smaller company versus to a bigger enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to, like any culture, in my opinion, is there's going to be like a few cornerstone individuals in an organization that really propel the culture and set the tone for the culture. It certainly works that way in design. So having a really like good head of design or VP of design or whatever it may be, I think a good leader is going to establish a lot of the culture. And what they're going to be able to do is hire other designers across a diverse set of backgrounds and skill sets and points of view that will then grow the culture from a grassroots perspective. Culture is inevitable, right? Like we talk so much about culture like it's a thing that you create or something like that. I mean, even if you say, I don't really give a crap about culture, like we're just here to make money and I don't really care about that, you're gonna have a culture nonetheless. It may suck, but you know, it's going to happen. And so, in my opinion, you know, a culture is really just, it's an amalgamation of the people that you have in your organization, making sure that those first few people that you bring on board in design and product and engineering and whatever, exhibit the culture that you feel is going to make your company successful. That's what's going to really scale the culture to the team. I also think that, you know, it doesn't have to totally align with like what your culture might be, right? Like design usually has a pretty distinct culture. A good design leader will have a distinct way of operating and seeing the world. They'll have a strong vision. And if you change that design leader, it'll change the culture of the team. And a lot of the time that's okay.
Mm-hmm. A few years ago, I worked for Schoology, the largest learning management system in the US, probably in the world, I would say. Millions of users per second on the platform, primarily kids. And we didn't even have like what we call like the design system. So every part of the application was, it felt something different. And then there was this designer, very good designer. She was originally from Spain, honestly. And she said like, we need a design system. We need a design system. The company was like 13 years old already. And now we are talking about starting a new design system. It costs Schoology not only time, but a lot of investment in rebuilding the teams, how we organized. And it was very painful, expensive, but we were able to make like lots of improvement in the user experience. So my question to you is, I talked before like about like burning a lot of gas. Oh, it was a fight every single day, multiple fights a day, to get the design embedded on the culture. If I could go back in time and if I could ask you for an advice, is that the way that we have to change the culture of like a design driven or like design mindset to, is that like a easier way of doing this or like to transforming or?
Well, I think it's better late than never.
Okay.
I think that even if you don't, so design systems are a great way to operate design at scale. But just like any other rigid system, which fundamentally most design systems are pretty rigid systems, it can also box you into a solution space. I have a love-hate relationship with design systems. At this point, a design system is standard practice. Any app or product operating at scale will probably have a design system.
Is it possible to scale without a design system? That's hard, right?
Because not with any sense of coherence in the product at this point, because the software products have gotten so big and they're expected to do so many things. Unless you're like ruthlessly focused and you're in a really, really niche space, your product is eventually going to get large enough to where, you know, like updating a button could become a very, very expensive thing because you have. I'm actually speaking from experience here. When I was at HubSpot, I established our first design system. It's still live today. It's, again, taken on a different form. But we had 131 instances of the same button in our product, right? So to update that button, 131 distinct lines of code would have to be made. And it was bizarre because it looked like the same thing. It had just been cloned over and over again. We had 12 different date pickers, and they all looked different. So if you needed to, you know, set a date in our email product to schedule an email send, or if you needed to set a date in our CRM to schedule like a follow-up meeting, you were looking at two different date pickers. A lot of people didn't notice it, but what the users can't tell you is they're like, something just feels off about this, right? And that's the cost of not having a design system on the experience and on the engineering load, right? So once we established the design system, like making that change to a button, it was like a flip of a switch, a super simple, you know, one line of code that had to be changed. It's a lot easier to establish a design system when you're small, the same way that it's easier to establish a design team when you're small.
That's super nice. And your team now is very distributed, or you work all together? Like how?
No. Square is a remote first company, and we were remote first before it was cool. we've been doing this for like 10 years or something like that.
Yeah.
We have offices. We're divesting a lot of our real estate. We've got like over 250 people here in Austin, and I haven't met any of them. In person, at least. We have like, happy hours and stuff like that.
For the good part.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we're a remote first organization. Pros and cons to that, right? Now most of us in this room have probably had some experience with that. But I think a lot of people's experience during COVID wasn't really like a true remote first experience where like you are designed from the ground up to be distributed. Really distributed is the better word.
I like that more.
Yeah. When I was at HubSpot, I was one of the first people to go remote. The company was fully co-located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just like off of MIT's campus. It was founded by a couple people from MIT. I went remote. I moved to Latin America, and it was like wild at first. To be like on a total island. I'm sure some people in this room have experienced that. And then eventually now, like over half the company is distributed. And so they're able to attract talent that otherwise they would have never had access to, and get into markets that otherwise they would have never had access to. For me, like working on the ground as a designer in Latin America, it was really cool. We were expanding into Latin America. Now the company has an office in Colombia, but it wasn't opened at the time. We were thinking about buying a company in Brazil. I got to meet with a bunch of people from that company. It was called RD Station. That didn't work out. Didn't end up going to Brazil. Went to Colombia, like I said. But because I was able to sort of like on the ground meet with a bunch of our customers or potential business partners, it actually changed the way that I thought about designing the product. Believe it or not, And so I'm getting a perspective from people in like Brazil and Argentina and Chile and Colombia, and then I would travel to other places too. But then, we had designers in California that were getting the California perspective. We have designers in Boston and everything like that.
It almost feels that like this diversification and geolocation is actually better to create more diverse experiences to user. Because I remember like hearing like during the pandemic, like how I missed the whiteboard and the collaborative like effort of designing and come up with ideas. But I guess that's another thing. You can still be designing experience for billions of users, and you don't need like a physical whiteboard.
Yeah, trust me. Sometimes I really wish I had a physical whiteboard. But yes, that's true. I mean, especially with tools like Figma, where you have multiplayer design. Who here has used Figma? Raise your hand. Okay, all right, cool. So
all right.
I'm glad that's
lots of hands. Yeah.
It's not just a design tool, actually. Like our product managers use it. Engineers are in there. Obviously now it has like really, really robust code assist tools.
Yeah.
So yeah, with tools like Figma, I think that there's not really an excuse. But what I do think is really powerful is to get the team together at least a couple times a year. So like my whole team, we're distributed across the US and Canada. But we get everybody together in New York or San Francisco a couple times a year, and those are intense weeks, But I remember when I was at Google, like I was going to the office every day, 45 minutes. I lived 11 miles from the office. It was 45 minutes each way. It was horrible. And I would go at like weird hours. I'd go in at like 11 a.m., and I'm still driving for 45 minutes one way. So much wasted time and energy. And then I would get to the office, and I mean, if you've ever been to the Googleplex, it's a huge, sprawling, amazing campus. Yeah. But it'll take you, it's a 20-minute bike ride from one end of it to the other. So often I would be in a meeting where I'm like alone in a room with a GVC, like the camera and everything, just like you do when you're at home, meeting with a ton of other people that are in offices at the same property that I'm at, all in rooms alone. Distributed like across the campus. I call that de facto remote. What that is to say is that like once you get to a certain scale of an organization, you're kind of remote or distributed, whether you like it or not. So I think that that's like one of the powerful things of adopting a distributed first mentality like we've done at Square, is that we owned that reality. And because we own that and we leaned into it instead of resisting it, we've been able to build our entire internal tooling systems, build our processes, even build our org structure in a way that supports that and makes us successful in a distributed environment.
Before we open for question, Austin, thank you very much. Any final advices to the audience, how to build great software, great design from 1 to a billion to 2 billions to zillions?
There's like so much that we could go into. I think that if you're not design minded, then earlier I mentioned like try to find somebody that's an established design leader that's done it before, so they can get the right talent for you. But there's another path as well, which is to learn about design, right? There's a lot of good podcasts and things like that. I have a podcast called UX and Growth where we talk about design. Design is, I think a lot of the time it can feel like a black box. But I think that like really great leaders, executives aren't afraid of black boxes, and they actually get themselves involved in the functional aspects of their organization. Like they get involved in the product strategy. That's usually a natural thing to do. They'll get involved in the engineering. If you have a technical co-founder, that's a natural thing for them to do. Not as common for them to get involved in the design. Maybe it's a little bit of a scary thing. But in my opinion, it's something that practically anybody can be taught. I mean, I'm a self-taught designer. I didn't go to school for this. I didn't even go to college. I taught myself how to like build websites and design stuff. It's a common story in our industry, actually. There's a lot of designers that are that way. And I also don't think I have like a particularly creative brain or anything like that. I wouldn't be an artist. I can't paint. So the reason I'm saying this is because I think that good leaders that want to invest the time to learn about design, they can do that. Podcasts are a good way to do it. Getting involved in your team's design files can be another good way to do it, just to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it.
It's self-taught designer, and with this incredible, journey, and it's really impressive. I'm very thankful to have this conversation with you here. Thank you very much, and please a round of applause for Austin here. Any questions? We can take a few questions, starting here in the front, and then we go all the way there, please. And I'll just...
Two essays, what would be a third essay that you wrote that you read?
Also, just repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, thanks for the 2 essays, what would be a third essay that I've written that I would recommend, or just a third essay in general?
Both.
Okay, both. If you go to austinknight.com, that's my personal site.
Can you repeat that?
austinknight.com. It's just myname.com, Knight with a K. I have several essays on there. I also have this thing called the UX Design Guide, which is like all of the basic tools and processes and everything like that. If you want to spin up a UX team at your company, I think that's a good place to check out. I wrote an essay about distributed teams. I did it before the pandemic, so it's an interesting perspective. I think it's held up.
It's a really good one.
Yeah, thanks. There is also there's an HBR article that I just read. It's about how Apple is structured for how it's structured functionally. If you just Google like how Apple is structured for functional success, I think is roughly the title of it. It should come up. It's a little bit of a long read, but it's really worth it because it goes into more detail on what I was talking about with how you would have like a head of design that all of design reports up into, that then reports to the CEO instead of having design reporting to like engineering or product or something like that. So if you want to better understand why Apple is structured that way, why we're structured that way, I think that's a good place to go to.
Thank you very much. Who else over here?
Hello, Austin. Just to build a little bit on what you just said, would it be that maybe the design team is the closest to the end user, and a company that is end user or consumer centric will consider that the person who has to make sure that product engineer, everything conveys to the way that the user is going to use your application or your solution. The best way to connect to that end user is you, the design team, and it's the one who has to really understand and really communicate with that person that is going to use the application.
Yeah, you're making a really important point. I wish I would have said it because it's a critical function that design plays, which is that a lot of the time they are your connection to your closest connection to your customers. At minimum, design usually does a pretty good job of developing empathy across the team. So helping other functions like engineering and product to put themselves in the shoes of the user. What I will say is that really, like, some of the best product managers that I've worked with, and definitely some of the best engineers, they understand your customers, your users, however you want to put it, just as well as the designers do. They just come at it from a different perspective. So I would say that design can play that function, but I also really think that, like, there should be an expectation that product and engineering are close to customers as well.
1000%. Like my engineers, like
or to the career ladder, and like the way you get promoted is by, you know, demonstrating several different accomplishments or qualities that relate to how close you are to the customer, to the business, whatever it may be. If you hire really, really good engineers that are really passionate, that really care, they'll do that stuff on their own. The best engineers don't really care what the incentive structure is. They're just going to do good work.
Yeah.
They're hard to find. But yeah, I think like you got to be close to customers.
Yeah. We have a few more. We're going to get to you here. Who is next?
Here. Yes.
Oh, right there.
I had a question. You said good designers recognize good designers, and what would be an example of a green flag for you? Like 2 signs that would make someone stand out. Where you're like, this is either a company that I want to work for, or this is talent that I want to bring on to my team.
It's a great question. 2 things. So one would be that the designer is able to articulate the why and not just the how, and in fact spends the majority of their time on the why. So when you're talking to me about something that you've been working on, I really don't care how you did it. I don't really care what tools you use. But by the time that you get to an on-site interview, I just hired 2 designers last week full-time, so this is like super front of mind for me. By the time that you get to an on-site interview, I've already validated that you can do the job. You know, like the hard skills have already been confirmed. At that point, it's more about the soft skills. And a lot of that comes down to your ability to articulate not what you did, but the relationship between this thing that I did and this thing that I did, and why I went from this to this. So like, I did research, and then I came up with a wireframe. And the reason that I did it is this, right? Really, it's that second part that I care about. Like, I expect that there is a certain process that the designer is following, but being able to articulate, especially if it goes back to the business or to the customer, the user, whatever it may be, that's where I think the most senior designers spend the majority of their time. They're also, you know, like really senior designers can speak about org structures and incentivization that like trickles down from org structures and stuff like that, which I think can be really interesting. So what they're getting at there is like they're able to deliver the full picture to you to help you to understand why the design is the way that it is. And sometimes that's like they're talking about why it's not as good as it could have been. You know? So some degree of self-awareness and honesty I think is really important, and also being able to speak to like what didn't go well and what you would do differently in the future. The second thing that I would say, and this is going to happen more in the sort of hard skills assessment, is looking at the delta between the final design and the implemented product. Because what this tells me is how high of a bar the designer has, not just for the design work, which you can get from the final design, but also for their collaboration with engineering and what kind of a standard the designer holds engineering to. Too often, you'll have designers that are like total rock stars. They can come up with something that looks amazing, and then it just does not look that way at all when you actually like download the app and try using it. Now, there can be factors outside of a designer's control that contribute to that. So I downplay that one a little bit with junior designers. But if a designer is senior staff principal, that needs to be, the delta needs to be really tight. They need to be getting that right. That's their responsibility. So if you're like thinking about going into design or hiring designers, those are two things that I would keep in mind.
Okay. Maybe you partially answered my question just now, but AI changed professions and how we work and make us more productive. In like 3 years, what current design skills will not be needed for designers to be hired, and what maybe new skills you will definitely require from designers?
That's a good one. I thought that he almost like will AI they actually replace design.
I think that if you look at we are using AI assisted tooling at Square right now, like Copilot. On the engineering side, there are very sort of similar parallel types of tools within design, a lot of which are just plugins for Figma, which I think is fantastic. A lot of what it does is it speeds up production, which is a good thing, because production is usually like the most annoying sort of lowest level form of design. There are such things as production designers. So some people really enjoy doing that type of design, which is to say, like, they already have a spec, they already have a direction, and it's like now just like get every state of this thing and build it out so that you can give it to engineering and they can like consider every single permutation of the design and the product. That's something that a product designer, especially as they become more senior, really doesn't want to spend much of their time doing. It's something that design systems were invented for. And so I think that a lot of the AI that we're seeing come into design right now is actually just building off of sort of like more manual structures that have already been put into place and automating them, like making it easier to build and maintain a design system, for example. And then you also have like the purely creative AI, like what you get from Midjourney and DALL-E and stuff like that. That is fabulous. I'm so excited about that because, for one, like it allows us to bring in so much richer creative into our design work. Like actually, a lot of the photography and the design work that my designers are doing right now is AI generated. And I mean, we used to spend tons of money on like really, really elaborate photo shoots and stuff like that. We still do it. Sometimes you need something so specific that AI can't do it. But a lot of the time now, with AI for like the first couple revs and then a little bit of Photoshop, you can get exactly what you need and you can get really, really rich creative. I also think that it might revolutionize the most common design standards that you're going to be interacting with in an app. So you may think back to like 2007, 2008, like early iPhone. A lot of that operating system and the apps and the UI that you were interacting with, it felt kind of 3D, right? That's called skeuomorphic design. That stuff is hard to do. Like it takes a lot of time to create a skeuomorphic design, a button that looks like a real button, or a radio app icon that looks like a classic radio or something like that. And the skill set required to do that usually is like it's a pretty specialized skill set. And so what that meant is that as usability became more and more important and instrumentation in these products became better and better, as in like we could better understand what performed well, that became the priority. And so building something that performed well and that would scale well led to something called flat design. You notice like most of what you're looking at now is just like flat rectangles and stuff like that. Why? Because the skill set to build something that scales well, that performs really well, that sort of human factors, core UX skill set, that's also a specialty. So being able to design something like 3D and being able to design something that like scales really well and is super effective and adheres to like human factors fundamentals if you can find a designer that does both of those, you've got a unicorn, and they're going to be really, really expensive. AI allows the designer that is designing now, today, as like a core UX or interaction designer using flat design to augment their skill set and bring back some of that more sort of creative, rich UI into their designs. So you're starting to see a little bit of this happening in certain corners on X and stuff like that, where designers that were like all about flat design are now, you know, bringing in like skeuomorphic 2.0. And I'm really excited about that because I think that the art interfaces have become like so commoditized, so bland, so common. So the opportunity to bring more creativity, more depth into design, I think is, it's going to have to be enabled by AI.
Austin, would you mind sticking a little longer?
Yeah.
There's like more people with questions, but as far as like it's time for us to wrap up here. So thank you once again. It was great building UX for billions. It was a pretty fun conversation. Thank you once again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for sticking around.